Alright guys, so in the last video what we did is we went ahead and showed one step at a time instead of showing all the steps at once using JavaScript. And we can click next, and then when we get to the very final step and we click next, it shows this, submit. So in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to validate and make sure that whatever they're typing into here is actually valid and passes our requirements. And we're also going to hook up our back button. Now the very first thing I want to do is go ahead and uncomment out this CSS that we commented out a couple videos ago. Now that we're displaying only one step at a time, it's not too tall and we can go ahead and do this and it looks a little better. The next thing I want to do is come down anywhere in your CSS file and add this invalid class. So I want you to copy this in here. And what this is doing is whatever has the invalid class, we're just giving it a 2-pixel solid red border. And we're going to use this for inputs. Whenever an input is invalid, it's going to have this invalid class. So let's go ahead and get started. The very first thing that we are going to want to do is we're going to go ahead and want to add 2 quick helper functions. And I will explain to you exactly what those do. So we have current input, which is a function, and it says this.form, this.step-1.input. So what we're doing is we're creating a function that whenever we call it, it's going to return the current input that we're on. And the same thing for previous input, except it's going to return the input that we were previously on. So the one directly before the one we were on. So the only difference is we have this -2 instead of -1. So now that we have these 2 functions, it's going to be really convenient for us to use. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and start our validation process. Now, when I click refresh and we look here and the next button's already enabled, we don't want that. We want this next button to be disabled by default. So we're going to go ahead and under this.getForm, we want to make sure that the form object has already been built. We're going to say document. Well, actually, we don't need to do that, but I just want to. So we're going to say document.getElementById, and we're going to grab the next button. That's the ID we gave it. And we're going to set the disabled attribute equal to true. So that effectively disables the button. So notice how it is disabled currently when we hover over it. One more thing is you notice this red circle here. That is a class that I added, and I need you guys to add it too so that we can stay consistent. Let's go ahead and find it really quick. It's this right here. I want you to copy this. This is saying for the next button, whenever it's disabled, the cursor will be not allowed. And that's what gives it this, this red circle here. I want you guys to have that. So go ahead and copy that. So I'll assume you went ahead and copied that, and we'll go ahead and move on to the next step. So now that we have that, what we're going to want is a couple of functions that do some validation and checks. The very first one is going to be a function literally called check. So go ahead and start this function up. Now what this is going to do is every time the user comes over to the input and types some stuff, they are going to, it's going to check whether or not the input is valid or not. And so what we want to do is go ahead and say this.currentInput, since we have that function, it makes it really convenient, dot add event listener. And we want to listen for key up. Whoops, got to be in the quotes. We want to listen for key up. And whenever we get key up, we're going to call a function. And for now, I'm just going to console.log key up. Now we're actually going to have to, call this function. So this is where order really does matter. Under this.refresh, just call this.check. So as you can see, each time I type something in the input, it's logging this key up string that we put here. But we don't want it to log that. What we want it to do is we want to call a function that we're about to create. So let's just go ahead and put it in here. Let's say this.enable disable. And we don't have to write it like this either. We can actually remove these and then just have it like this. This is how we want to write it right here. Cool. So let's go ahead and create enable disable. So this function is going to rely on another function called valid. So we'll go ahead and have this function exist now and just have it always return true for now, and we'll come back to it. Now this function is going to take an input, so go ahead and have this ready. And for now, like I said, it's just going to return true. We'll come back to it in a minute. So what we're going to do is we're going to say if this.valid, and it takes an input, so let's pass it this.currentInput. So if If it's valid, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and say this dot current input, grab the input, dot class list, dot remove invalid. We want to remove the invalid class if it's valid. And then we want to set the listeners. And then the final thing that we're going to want to do is actually go ahead and enable our button. So we're going to go ahead. In fact, you can just come up here and copy this line and paste it, and then just change true. Well, you keep it. Change true to false. Sorry, because we're setting the disabled attribute to false, which effectively enables the button. Else is going to be the complete opposite of this. So we're going to say this dot current input. I keep pasting this. All right, this dot current input dot class list dot add, and we want to add the invalid class. And then we want to remove the listeners. And then we're going to just, again, copy this. And it's the complete opposite. So just change false to true. That disables the button. Cool. So we save that. Now remember, this is returning true by default. So when I type something here, it's automatically going to enable the button because it's running down this path. So let's have it return false and see what that looks like. Now, it gives us this invalid class, which gives us the red border, and it does not enable the button. So now that we have that, let's go ahead and actually implement our valid function. So as I said, we're passing the input, but we want stuff from the input. We don't want the input itself. So let's go ahead and grab the form type and set it equal to input.id. And I'll show you what that basically means. So say we're on the email verification input. Then the form type is going to be the input's ID, which is email verification input. So keep this file open because we're going to be copying and pasting some stuff in just a second. So we have the form type, and we also want the value. So the value is going to be equal to input.value. Cool. Now we're going to create a small function here called empty. And what it's going to do is it's going to take a string, and it's literally going to check whether or not a string is nothing but empty white space characters, because we're also gonna want to make sure, you know, when you're typing stuff in here, when we're logging in, this is when it really matters that we're not just putting a bunch of empty spaces in here and clicking next. We want to make sure that the username that we provide when we try to log in, at least someone is typing something. So we don't really need this, but it's going to be nice for the user. It's going to give them a better experience. So what we're going to do is we're going to break the string down into an array, and then we're going to use the every function that's built into the array object in order to check whether or not it's an empty string. Now I created a video on the every function for the array object, and I highly recommend you go check that video out. I'll put it in the description. I use almost this exact same example, and I go over it in great detail. So please, if this seems a little foreign to you, please go check out that video and come back. So we're going to go ahead and break our string down into an array. And then we're going to use that. We're going to use every. And for every character, we want to make sure that the character does not equal a white space character. And we want to flip the Boolean value, because by default, if I didn't have this flip here, this unary operator is what it's called, then this would return. So if this string was empty, this would actually return false, but we want it to return true if it's empty. So we're just flipping it. Cool. So now the next thing we want to do is we want to go ahead and by default say if value doesn't exist, or if it's falsy, or the string is empty, then we want to go ahead and return false by default. That way we can just get that out of the way. Now if we make it this far, we're going to go ahead and do our custom checking here. So I want you to create a switch statement. And what we're going to be switching on is form type. Now, under the case of the email, we're going to use the ID email input here. We're going to return true for all of these for now, and then we're going to explain, I'll explain to you guys what we're doing in just a minute. So let's go ahead and create all of our cases. So we have email input, then we have email verification input, put your colon, return true. Then we have another case, which is going to be our password input. return true. And then the final case, and I put a semicolon, that's supposed to be a colon. All right, the final case is going to be our password verification input. Let's go ahead and copy that one in. Great, and then return true. Now, the default case is when none of these are the case, it just goes to this default case. We just want to return false because if we make it this far, then something's wrong anyway. It should only be one of these four. So we'll go ahead and return false as our default. So the two easiest ones are going to be the email verification input and the password verification input. So let's think logically for a second. What we want to do is when we're verifying either an email or password, we want to see whether or not the current input's value is equal to the previous input's value. So all we're going to do is we're going to return a statement that's going to become either true or false, which is going to be this.previous input, that function we created that returns the previous input, dot value must be equal to the current value that we have here. And so if this.previous input.value is equal to value, that'll be true, and then it'll return true as valid. And we're going to use this exact same line here for the password verification input. Now we're going to get into a little bit more of the complicated ones. So we're going to use regular expressions, and in this video I'm not going to explain how to use regular expressions, but instead I'm going to kind of explain what each section of the regular expression is doing. And if you want to learn more about regular expressions, I'm planning to do a video on it in the future, but if you want to learn now, please go on YouTube and do some research, or go anywhere on the internet and do some research on it, because they're actually very helpful. And I would highly recommend anybody who's trying to become a developer to understand regular expressions. So let's start with the email input, because that's going to be the easy one to go with it in the beginning. All right, let's go ahead and get this ready. All right, so regular expressions in JavaScript, what we do is we use, let's see here, we use two slashes like this, and then we put our regular expression in between. And then we can use functions such as test in order to test against our regular expression. In this case, we want to use this regular expression. And I want you to copy this and then put .test value. And what this is doing is it's just making sure that there's some letters, there's an @ symbol, there's some, there's a dot, and then there's some more letters. That's all it's doing. And so it's checking to make sure that the email is in fact a valid email. Now the password one is going to be a little bit more complicated. So let's go again through each section of this. So create your two forward slashes. Now the first one is going to check to make sure we have at least one digit. That's this part. The second part is going to make sure that we have at least one lowercase letter. This part is going to make sure that we have at least one uppercase letter. And then this last one is kind of two birds with one stone. It's going to say it should contain at least 8 from the mentioned characters and also the allowed symbols that we have. Now what this is not doing is it's not making sure, in other words, let me put it this way. This particular regular expression does not test and make sure that you do have one of these symbols. It's just saying that you are allowed to use these symbols. So here's some homework for you guys. If you want to learn regular expressions, you can go and force the password to use one of these symbols so it's an even more secure password. But for now, we're not going to force them to use a symbol. We're just going to say you can use a symbol if you want to, and it has to be one of those. And we're going to use .test, and we're going to test the value against that. All right, let's see what happens here. So I'm typing some stuff. Let's see if I can type a valid email here. It does enable. Great. So I click next. Now let's try to confirm the email. See, here's the problem that I'm noticing already though. As you can see, when I clicked next, if I do this one more time, just to demonstrate as I talk, when I click next here, this is already enabled. It should be disabled by default. So the reason why this is the case is because in the refresh function, we actually need to go in and manually disable the, let's see, where's the refresh function? It's down here. We need to disable the next button, but we also have to call this .check. So let's do both of those. In fact, there's a couple of things that we need to do. So go ahead and cut this. And what we need to do is add some curly braces because we're adding some more lines to our if statement. So paste this back in. And now we're going to want to say document. Actually, the very first thing that we're going to want to do is call this dot remove listeners. So we'll go ahead and remove the listeners. So we're not going to listen for clicks on our next button anymore, not for now. Then we're going to disable the button. So document.get element by ID next button dot disabled is going to be equal to true. And then we're going to want to call this dot check. Cool. So let's see if it works as expected now. Zach at portexe.com. Click next. Now it's disabled by default. Great. So now let's see. So I'm typing some stuff in and it's showing that it's not valid because it doesn't match what we just put a minute ago. So let's see what happens when I type in the M here, the very final letter. It enables. Now I can go to the next one. Now let's see the password. So I'm going to type in a password here, and as soon as it's valid, it goes ahead and makes it valid for us. Great. So let's see if this one works. And it matches. Great. And I click next and it says submit. Now let's do a hypothetical problem here, okay? Let's say we got to confirm your password and I start to type some stuff here. I say do. Whoops. Okay, so now let's go over a quick hypothetical situation. Let's say we go through and we're creating our account. I click next, confirm the email. I click next. Now I have to create a password. And I click next. Now I'm here and I start to type in my password and I'm like, what the heck? Why isn't it enabled? And it's probably because what happened was in the previous step, I didn't type the right password. I accidentally put in a typo, and now that I'm here, I'm typing in the password that I expected or that I thought I typed in, but it's not actually enabling. So what I need to be able to do is go back and then fix that. So we're going to need to create a function called go back. So just put this in here. Now we're not going to want to go back if this.step is 1 or 0, obviously, because we want to make sure it's greater than 1. And the reason why we want to make sure it's greater than 1 is because obviously if we're on the first step, there is no previous step. So the only way we can go back is if we're further than the first step. So the first thing that we want to do is go ahead and say this.step minus minus. We're decrementing the step by 1. We're going to display the step. And then we're going to go ahead and recall this.enable disable. Now we actually need to set an event listener for the back button. So in our set listeners function, let's go ahead and copy this, paste this line down here, change next to back, and then change this.refresh to this.go back. Save, and let's make sure that this works really quick. Click next, click back, and now we're on the previous input. But now there's one more problem. Let's say I go here and I type some stuff and then I decide I want to go back because I typed in the wrong thing, and I click back and then I fix it and I go next. Well, this is already typed in. I don't want that. I want this to be blank again. So what we're going to have to do is the very first step inside of go back above this.step minus minus, we want to say this.current input dot value is equal to an empty string. Therefore, we essentially erase the input. So let's see. Okay, enabled. Enabled. Click next. Type in a password. Click next. Then I'm like, okay, I'm typing in my password and I can't get it to work. So I'm like, what the heck? I must have typed in the wrong password. I click back. I go and I type in the password that I actually want. Click next. And let's see if it works now. And now it works, and I click next and it says submit. So now we have essentially a front-end validated form here. Let's make sure it actually works with our login page as well. So now I type in my email. Now I'm noticing something that I don't like. I'm seeing that I'm still getting that front-end validation for our login, when in reality for our login, the only thing we really want to check for is that the user actually typed something. And if they type in the wrong email or password, we'll get that from the server. So we don't really want to do all this validation checking on the login page. We really only want to do it on the sign up page. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a variable here at the top called this.pageType. This.pageType, and we're going to set it equal to window.location.href.includes login. And if our URL includes login, we're going to set it equal to login. So the page type will be login. Otherwise, we're going to set it equal to signup. And then inside of our valid function, what we're going to do is we're going to check for the page type. So here, up here at the top, underneath this line right here, we're going to say if this.pageType is equal to login, then we want to return value. Whoops, I am still inside of the parentheses. We want to return value and not empty value. And the reason why we're doing this, I cannot type today. The reason why we're doing this is because we want the value to exist and we want it to not be empty. So let's save and see if this, yeah, see now it's invalid because there's nothing there. The user has to at least type something. We click the first thing and now it works. So now I can click next, and again, it's disabled until I type at least one character. Now in the next video, we're gonna actually hook up our login and our sign up page to a actual backend server through Firebase, and we can actually set up some backend validation. In other words, if we type in the wrong username and password and I click next, instead of just saying submit down here, it's gonna try to log in. And if we get the wrong credentials, it's gonna come back from the server saying, hey, you typed in the wrong stuff. And we're gonna display a message on here that says incorrect login information. All right, guys, if you like this video, give me a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time.